Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm Dr. David Pendergrass. I received an email the other day from someone who listened to my podcast, found it on Twitter, and I just want to read part of this. And please don't, if you don't know me, well, a lot of you don't know me, but I'm not being braggadocious. I'll tell you why I'm reading in a second. He says, he's asking questions about hell, which I want to talk to you about in just a second. But he says this at the very end of his email. He said, also, just wanted to let you know that you have really opened my eyes. I was definitely a quasi-Christian for 30 years, and in a lot of aspects I still am. Somehow one of your tweets found its way to my timeline, and I hope my life has been changed for good. And for that I'm eternally grateful to you. And I just want to tell you, that kind of stuff is profoundly encouraging to me. I mean, it really is. That means so much to me. That kind of stuff just makes your day or your week. It really does. And as you might imagine, I know that I've got some number of people listen to this podcast regularly, and that means so much to me because you don't hear much from the podcast, here and there, and you never really know. And I'm a human, and sometimes I struggle, knowing what difference it makes. And so I got that. I'm publicly praising God because I think God inspired him to say that. That means so much to me, and it gives me encouragement to keep doing the podcast in the midst of my schedule. And so you know who you are, who wrote that, and I just want to say God bless you, and thank you so much for saying those very, very kind words. It just means so much. These kind of emails that I get from time to time, they mean so much. So thank you so much. He asked a question about hell, and he said, for example, is hell, is it a place of literal fire, eternal darkness, desperation, and loneliness? Are you under the direction of Satan and his demons? Do you have free will in hell? Can you be redeemed from hell? Now, these are great questions, and I don't want to spend a whole long time on the topic because we can. There's numerous books on the topic that explore all of it. If I can, I'll just make some quick reflections. First of all, the Bible doesn't have just one way of talking about it. You need to understand that in the Old Testament, ancient Jews did not have a conception of hell as it later on developed. And sometimes in translations, that is confusing. It causes people to be confused because they might translate Sheol as hell. Sheol in the Old Testament was the common go-to image for an ancient Jew. And Sheol just meant the place where dead were. The dead were, that's it. It typically is spoken down below, but of course it is. That's where you bury a body. And since you don't see those people again walk around, the assumption is beneath the earth, there's a place called Sheol. Hebrews did have conceptions of afterlife. Sometimes that's overplayed and say they didn't think about the afterlife at all, and then the Christians came around and invented all that, or Jesus did. Well, that's nonsense. If you read the Old Testament carefully, there's a whole lot of talk about what happens after death. Now, there's not a lot of descriptions about it, but there's a lot of talk about it. So Sheol is the place of the dead, and you don't like Sheol to a Hebrew, not because it's punishment, and not because it's torment, but because they believed you were not in the quote-unquote presence of Yahweh because you couldn't go to the temple. And so the psalmist often asked God to rescue them from the pit or Sheol. And sometimes it's just a metaphor. Other times it means literal. I don't want to die. Now, why is that? Because they're extolling God. I want to be with you in the temple forever and ever. Sometimes it's given a metaphor of Abraham's bosom, but Sheol is there and the dead ones are there. And ancient Hebrews did believe that certain people had the capacity to communicate with those who had died. And those kind of people were spoken against. You didn't want to go talk to those people. But all that to say, they did have a conception of the afterlife. It just wasn't very developed. At least it's not described much. They might have believed more than they described, but it certainly was a place of the dead, where the dead go. They do not cease to exist. They live on in this Sheol, shadowy existence. By the time we get to the intertestamental period, by the 1st, 2nd century BC, there is more development within Judaism about the state of their existence. They start talking a little more, and again, just for time, I'm sparing you by reading all the texts in Judaism. They start speaking a little more about how people who have died can experience the bliss of the heavenly world, that is, good feelings and joy and peace, and some might experience bad feelings. That is to say, they start experiencing a foretaste of God's judgment, final judgment. That's not happened yet. By the time we get to the New Testament, we certainly see it already. And so one of the most common images in the New Testament is the image of a place that literally existed. That literal place was called Gehenna. Now, Gehenna was the name of an actual place, a trash dump that burned outside the Jerusalem city gates. And in most modern translations, it'll say either hell as a translation of Gehenna, or it will just simply transliterate. Jesus will say Gehenna. Again, surely Jesus did not believe that those who died went literally to the trash dump outside of the Jerusalem city gates or the walls. It was a metaphor for somewhere awful. So, for example, Jesus can use different images for hell. He can talk about it, and you'll see this in translations just as hell. Matthew talks about it the most, but Mark uses some. I'll use Mark since Matthew uses a lot of Mark. In Mark 9:43, when Jesus is talking about not sinning, and he says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. Now, hell there is Gehenna. So, Gehenna. So there, of course, if you're a first century Jew and Jesus is talking to you, you heard the word Gehenna. It's like saying New York. That is, it's an actual spot. They would not have gone, what's that I don't know, where's Gehenna? They would have thought, oh, New York, okay, it's up there. Or where's Dallas? They'll think of a location. And they don't really think God sends people to the fiery pit. Surely not. They understand it means after judgment. So Jesus can say things like that. And he says later on the same kind of verse that if you have 2 feet, it's better than cut off your feet than be thrown into hell. In Mark 9:47, better pluck out one of your eyes than be thrown into hell. It's the same thing over and over. He can also talk about a fiery furnace. Fiery furnace, like in Matthew 13:50, Jesus says, and throw them into a blazing furnace or fiery furnace where they will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So one of probably the most common image Jesus can use for this place of punishment is a burning place. Now, what he means by the metaphor of burning place is not exactly clear. You can see it as a description of destruction, because stuff that's thrown in the literal Gehenna, the fire dump, gets burned up alive. So it is certainly possible that's what he means. This kind of interpretation is called annihilationism, the belief that God's judgment of those who don't make it into the heavenly realm or heaven or the world to come, they are destroyed. We remember a little footnote here. If you think that the soul lives on forever no matter what, that's what Plato believed. That's a Platonic belief. That's not a Christian belief. Christians and Jews believe that if we live on, it is only by God's gift. Existence, life itself, is always at the discretion of God the Father, Son, and Spirit. Always. We do not exist by necessity. We do not have what is called aseity. We don't exist because we have to. We exist because we were brought into existence, and God can take us out. Bill Cosby, before we knew that he was drugging women, used to say, when his parents, if we talk about children, parents say, I brought you into this world, and I can take you out. Well, that's how it is with God. So that's one idea about hell, is that it's a fire that when at judgment time we cease to exist. It could also be, and all these could be combined, who knows, but maybe one image is, and this is a little more common also, is the assumption that Gehenna, which is an awful, nasty place that burns all the time, and it's just it's a trash dump that's burning all the time. It's also outside of the city gates. It's excluded from the community of the faithful. It's where you take trash. People don't live there. So many interpreters think that's at minimum one of the major points of the metaphor Jesus is making, is that hell is exclusion from the community of the faithful. And this is what's going on in only a couple references that talk about being separated from the presence of God. For example, in 2 Thessalonians 1:9, Paul says, they will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. You see those kind of references only a couple times in the New Testament about being outside of the presence of him. And that's almost certainly based on the allusion back to the temple. That is, outside of the temple, you're not directly in the presence of God. So when you get closer and closer, you're in the presence of God. So we shouldn't push that too far, though. on an ontological level, on a being existence level, because you cannot go anywhere that God is not. God is omnipresent. So when we say hell is separation from God, we need to be nuanced and clear about this. It means separation from God's presence that's experienced by joy and love and peace and kindness. You don't have immediate access to him to experience those things. You are separated from that aspect of him. So my theology professor used to say, the fire that warms is the fire that burns. That is, it's the same fire. It depends on the condition in which the person comes to the fire. If I'm cold, I want to be warmed. If I'm hot, it'll just burn me. That's how it is with God and his destruction. So to be in the presence of the Lord is a good thing when I want to be there, and when I'm rewarded with that presence. When I don't want to be there, then I'm not rewarded with his presence. I'm quote unquote separated from the presence of God. But it doesn't mean we literally have no access to God whatsoever, because that would assume we can go to a place where God does not exist, and that is logically false. That doesn't make any sense. Other times, Jesus and some authors will talk about hell being a place where it's darkness. And there are numerous texts that speak of that, or gnashing of teeth. And those kind of references, it demonstrates that it can't be the case that hell is a place where you're always just extinguished, because if that's true, then what about these texts that sound as if a person is consciously aware? They're gnashing their teeth because they're mad, they're angry. And they're mad, they're a rebellion against God. They're mad, probably the assumption is they're mad at their punishment. I didn't want to get judged, and they did, and they're mad at him. Well, obviously, this is metaphor upon metaphor. So he uses Gehenna or a fire, that's Gehenna, that's the trash dump. But people do not live there in the trash dump and they gnash their teeth. So you put all these things together, it seems to me that the best we can do, and I mean this in a good way, the best we can do is to say hell is a place that is horrible, it's awful, you don't want to go there, you're excluded from the community of the faithful, you're excluded from the presence of God, the one that you want to be in, and it's the place where the vile people go and the rebellious people go. There's numerous texts that speak about this, particularly in Revelation, but it's all over the place. Like in Revelation 21:8, the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all the liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. It's a place where all the bad people go, and you don't want to be in that community. Even in Revelation, the assumption is there is the people of God, and it's described as a city, and the doors are open, but on the inside are the faithful, but on the outside are these other people, and they don't have access. So if there is an image in the New Testament, it seems to be the case. Now, we have not, just in this short podcast, I've not reflected on all the biblical text, but I'm giving you a conclusion. And if you don't trust me, that's fine. Really, go look up every single reference for yourself and read all the literature. It seems to be the case that the general Jewish and Jewish Christian view of hell is this. Hell is a place where God sends people who are sinners. And it is a state of existence where they are excluded from God's blissful, joyful, happy experience. That is to say, it seems to be the case that it's not because they cease to exist, so maybe some do, but rather it's a place of punishment. So in your question, you said, is it a place of literal fire? I do not think it's a place of literal fire. I have no reason to think that. I know the image is used of fire, but that's because of Gehenna. I think it's not a literal fire. Is it eternal darkness? Maybe. I mean, is it literally dark there? Perhaps. Again, I think the point is darkness is contrasted to light. Light is where God is, dark is where he's not. So I'm not real sure how much literalness to take the darkness. That is, people in hell, can they see in front of them? I don't know if we should push it that far, but darkness is bad. And you said, is it desperation and loneliness? To that I would say, that's probably a fair assumption. It's probably a fair assumption to think that people in hell experience loneliness and desperation. It always reminds me of C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, which is just wonderful. Lewis's image of hell is at a place where people are overwhelmingly self-absorbed, narcissistic, prideful, and they want to be excluded. And the guy who's down visiting hell, there are houses that he sees way in the distance, miles and miles away, and these are people who have been there for a long time. Because over time, when people get close to them, they hate it. They want to be farther and farther away. So it's a profoundly isolated, lonely experience, but they're so convinced they're right and that everyone who taught them righteousness or whatever, and particularly God, is wrong, they spend forever deluded, just narcissistic, convinced they're right, always mad, always thinking they're a victim, everyone's out to get them. It's a profoundly dark, lonely, bitter, resentful existence. And I would say that's probably a fair assumption of what hell is like, to be apart from the joy and peace and love that God offers. Remember Dante's Inferno, Dante's picture of hell, the deepest part is cold. It's like ice. People are frozen. There's no heat of the love of God there. I don't know if that's exactly right. I'm not saying there's cold. There are no biblical verses that say it's cold, but the metaphor, I think, holds. You also ask, are you under the direction of Satan and his demons? No. The Bible never says that we're under the direction of Satan. Hell, as a punishment place, is a place where we go to be punished, including Satan, at least in Revelation. In Revelation, it's where he goes to. He goes into the abyss and it's locked up. That almost certainly is the same sense of hell. So you're not ruled by Satan. You're all equals there. So are the demons. You also ask, do you have free will in hell? Can you be redeemed from hell? It does certainly seem to be the case that you do have free will in hell. That is, there's nothing in the text to suggest that we stop being human. Now, to be human means we have soul and body right now. I mean, it's a minimum. That's what makes a human person. But to have a human soul means we have certain capacities. The human soul has the capacity to reason, have free volition, free will. It can have desires and wishes. It can feel things and so forth. We have no indication that God takes away one of the main capacities of the human soul. So it seems to be the case that in hell, I would deduce that, yes, they do have free will. If they go to hell, they still have free will, just like you have free will when you go to the heavenly realms or world to come or heaven. Well, then the issue, of course, is, well, can they change their mind? There are two ways to look at that. On the one hand, but both would say no. On the one hand, the dominant biblical New Testament image is that they cannot change their mind, the assumption is, because they have been punished. See, Jews have no problem believing that God is perfectly moral and he can do what he daggum wants to do, and that evil people deserve to be punished. We in society think that right now. Think about that. How upset do you get when a jury finds a pedophilic murderer guilty and sends him to life in prison? Are you mad about that? Is that unfair to you? What if someone gets murdered, they pull the trigger and they get shot in the head, and it kills a person, and they know they have evidence, and the person gets a life sentence in prison? A life sentence. Let's say they're a teenager, 19, let's say 19 years old, okay? And they go to prison for life for murdering. Where do you see the picket signs? Where are people picketing that and saying that's not fair? It only took 1/2 of a second to pull the trigger. And are you telling me that a 1/2 a second deserves a lifetime of punishment? That's not fair. It's not fair that a millisecond or 1/2 a second, whatever, gets that long of a punishment. No one protests that. The reason why no one protests that is because we all know the gravity of the offense. The gravity of the offense. In the Bible, the way you can tell if something's really bad to God, because all sins are not equally weighted and their consequence, is you can look at their consequence. How bad is it to God? Look at what he says is the punishment. And this is where people get real ticked off at God. But see, we do that in society all the time, and no one gets ticked off about that because we all know that's fair. It's fair. If I shoot a tree, I don't go to jail. If I shoot a human, I do. It takes the same time to to pull the trigger, but one's a crime and one is not, because it depends on what I've done. Well, in the biblical picture, that's exactly how I understand God's punishment. It's absolutely fair to go to a state of punishment because of the nature of the offense. So, one view is that you cannot be redeemed forever, if that's how hell is to be understood, because the nature of the offense is so bad, you are punished forever. That is, when you break the law, God's law, and reject him, that's the ultimate conceivable offense. Much like murder is a horrible, horrible offense here in human society. Well, in a biblical picture, rejecting God is the worst conceivable punishment. So one idea is that God can punish you forever. And so no, even if you wanted to change your mind, you can't because you've offended him so badly by rejecting him. Not just offended his honor, like, how dare you? But you've broken the ultimate rule, and you deserve to be punished. That is a common theme in the New Testament that many people today don't like to talk about. It sounds offensive to them. It's not offensive to me. It seems like a perfectly rational and logical thing because we do that in society all the time. In fact, prison is a place where we deliberately exclude people from the community. Howard Marshall makes this point in one of his books on atonement, and it's a very good point. That's what we do to criminals. Part of the punishment is separation from the community of their loved ones and family and friends. Well, that's what God will do too, and he has every right to do it. We believe we have the right to do it, regardless if the criminal thinks she is innocent, regardless he or she thinks that she doesn't feel guilty for what she's done. Their feeling of guilt is simply irrelevant. It's irrelevant because they don't get to decide what's right and wrong. The great mass of rational people get to decide what's right and wrong because we all know the great mass of people have a moral law inside of them and we judge them accordingly. Well, where do we think we get that moral law from? It comes from God. And God has every right to punish us, and he punishes us perfectly. He is absolutely fair. So the Bible's dominant theme is that we cannot be redeemed because our punishment is deserved and fair. Little footnote, people who often die and come back to life, post-mortem experiences, many of those who have died and experienced a sense of hell already, a common thing they say is, I knew I was in hell, or that was my punishment, and it felt fair. I knew this is what I deserved. Isn't that fascinating? They'll say, I didn't like it, but I knew it felt fair. On the other hand, what Christians have said, can a person be redeemed? They'll say no, because they don't want to. And by far the most commonly known advocate of this view is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis says, if hell is locked, it's locked from the inside. That is to say, they don't want to come out. They might want certain things, but they would and can never start to will repentance. They are so set in their ways, they won't do it. So hell is locked from the inside. God's love is always pouring out, but they will never, ever want it. Now, that is certainly possible, and it's more amenable to our modern taste. Okay, that makes more sense. That way, it's not mean old God up there sending people to hell. It's the person's choice. Well, I'd say there are some texts in the New Testament that seem to suggest that, but that is not the dominant New Testament or biblical model. The dominant New Testament model is the first option, which is God is morally perfect, and he has every right to do what he wants to, and people who are sinners deserve hell. Another little footnote. People don't go to hell because they reject Jesus. Christians should stop saying that. It's not so simple like that. I know you can go to a couple Bible verses. People go to hell because they're sinners. Hell is just for sinners. It's like saying people die. I hate this, and part of the hand, I hate this analogy because it's so sad, but if I had a terrible, terrible cancer that right now for which there is no cure, and they say, well, let's say there is a cure for it, but it'll kill you if you don't take the medicine. People die because they didn't take the medicine. Well, that's not why they died. They died because they had cancer. They could have been saved had they took the medicine, but they died because of cancer. Now, the analogy is not perfect. It's not maybe not good because cancer was not willed, wasn't decided upon. I'll use a different analogy. Someone who was offered to clean up their addiction, a meth addiction, and they chose not to, even when they were lucid, even when they felt badly and they had rock bottom and they said, I need to go to therapy. They went to therapy and said, forget it, I'm out of here. And then their addiction killed them, as it were. Their choice not to get help killed them. But the therapy home, the therapists were not to blame. The bottom line is, God is not to blame for what people decide to do. Now, I have other podcasts on what about those who have never heard the gospel? And you can go listen to that. What about those who have never heard the gospel, who have never received the gospel? Do they all go to hell? Well, it depends on what your view is, and there's different ways to look at that. This person who wrote the email goes on to say, I once heard someone in the Catholic Answers radio station say there was no literal hell, but just an eternal sleep with separation from God. Well, to that I'd say, well, that's maybe what they believe. The Bible doesn't give that exact statement. It is true that people, quote unquote, sleep. That is an image used throughout the New Testament, particularly by Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. Remember when he says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep." Those who are asleep. But again, that's a metaphor. He knows that means those who have died. People who are dead look like they're asleep. They're lying very still. So the problem is people take the term, the metaphor asleep, and think it means that when we're dead, we are unconscious. We are unconscious of what is occurring. And we, quote unquote, wake up when it's judgment time. There are very few texts in the Bible that suggest that idea. In fact, more often than not, it seems to assume that we are conscious in a conscious state. But again, the text doesn't say a whole lot about what we might call the intermediate state. What I find so fascinating is that those who have died and come back, they in fact are very, very, very conscious. So if I were a betting guy, I would say that they are not asleep in the sense of being unconscious and unaware. I think as soon as our soul leaves our body, we are always conscious. We never, ever stop being conscious of our existence. Never stop being conscious of our existence. No matter where we're going, I think we're always, in that sense, very aware. Now, most Catholics think there is no literal hell in the sense of a place of eternal punishment forever. Some Catholics do believe that, but most Catholics hold out to the idea that if there being a state of punishment, it's a temporary thing, and that's called purgatory. It's like hell, but a microwave. So there's a time limit. You get all the sin purified off of you, and then you get out. So in the end, everybody will be redeemed. And this is called Christian universalism. It's not pluralism, it's universalism. That universal, every creature, including Satan, will eventually one day be redeemed. Well, those are some quick thoughts. I'm sorry this is kind of longer than I want it to be. If you have any more questions about that, send me a note, and I'll be happy to help how I can. But I encourage you to go back to the text. Do a Google search and put in like Bible verses on hell and look up every single one for yourself, or Bible verses on eternal damnation. Look them all those up, and you'll see for yourself. There's not a whole lot explicit, but you'll see some of the stuff I've talked about here today. If you don't know Jesus, I don't want you to go to hell. So I hope you'll submit yourself to him. Put your trust in Jesus alone, because when judgment day comes, you do not want to be on your own defending your own case. You don't want to be on your own defending your own case. You'll want someone else to defend your case for you. And praise Jesus, we have someone who can do that. See you next time.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com. If you look at the top, you'll see various tabs that have sermons I've preached, a link to all the podcasts I've done so far, a link to my consulting website. For more information about my consulting, see davidpendergrassconsulting.com. Also, you'll see information about the books I've written that are found on amazon.com. So davidpendergrass.com, one-stop shop, all that you need. If you want to reach out to me, follow me on Twitter, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, and send me a message. I'll see you online. I gotta run and tell about what the Lord has done for me.